The house at the end of Ashwood Drive, number 13, was not just a structure of wood and stone. It was a wound in the fabric of reality, a festering sore on the face of our otherwise unremarkable town. It stood there, a Gothic monstrosity against the perpetual gray of the sky, a monument to forgotten sins and unspeakable horrors. They said that families had vanished within its walls, swallowed whole by the darkness, that strange lights danced in its windows on moonless nights, and that a silence deeper than the grave clung to the air around it. The older generation spoke of it in hushed tones, their eyes wide with a fear that was passed down through generations, a fear that we, the youth, had dismissed as nothing more than the ramblings of the superstitious. Until, of course, we were forced to confront it ourselves. My name is Alex, and I can tell you that the stories are true, more terrifyingly true than anyone could imagine. I was 22, a university student studying history. Ironic, given what was about to happen. I lived in an old house, several blocks away from Ashwood Drive. I had heard the stories, of course, but I was a creature of reason, a skeptic who scoffed at ghost stories and old wives' tales. I believed in logic, in science, in the tangible world. But the intangible world, the world that existed just beyond the veil of our perception, was about to make itself known to me, and the silence, the eerie stillness that surrounded number 13, was about to be shattered by the static. It began on a night as ordinary as any other. It was the 27th of October, a Thursday, just after 8 o'clock in the evening. I was in my attic, struggling with a research paper when it began. A subtle tremor in the air, a faint hum that seemed to vibrate within the very bones of the house. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or some strange electrical interference, but it grew, gaining strength, becoming a palpable presence in the room. It wasn't the sound of a radio, not quite, but rather the sense of being between stations, the cacophony of frequencies rubbing against each other, a low, insidious drone that seeped into the subconscious. I soon realized it was coming from everywhere. I tried to ignore it, but the static was relentless, like a parasite burrowing deep into my mind. It was a physical sensation, a pressure that pushed against my skull, a low vibration that made my teeth ache. That night, I barely slept, the static a constant companion, a reminder that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. The next day, I met Liam, my best friend, at our usual diner. I tried to explain what I was experiencing, but he just laughed, his words dismissive, his face mocking. "Dude, you're just stressed out with the study. I bet those old houses are getting to your head." He took a bite of his burger. "Next you'll start seeing ghosts and talking to the ghosts." I tried to laugh too, but his words had planted a seed of unease in my heart. The casual mention of those old stories about number 13. That night, the static returned, and it was no longer a subtle hum. It was a roar, a deafening assault on my senses. It wasn't just in my house. I could hear it outside, in the streets, pulsing beneath the city's usual cacophony. I looked out my window and saw it, a flickering light, a pale, sickly luminescence emanating from the direction of Ashwood Drive. It was like a dying ember, struggling against the encroaching darkness, a beacon calling to me from the very depths of the abyss. I could feel it, a morbid curiosity, a dark hunger, pulling me towards it. I told myself it was my imagination, but I already knew that it wasn't. The pull, the magnetic energy was far too strong. I grabbed my phone, the light of its screen a pathetic defense against the encroaching night, and began to walk towards Ashwood Drive, my boots crunching on the dry leaves that seemed to have been drained of all moisture, all life. The closer I got to number 13, the more the static intensified, the air itself vibrating with the malevolent energy emanating from the house. It was as if the world was being squeezed, every surface trembling. Standing at the base of the driveway, I could feel the house watching me. The darkness surrounding it was not a natural darkness. It was an absence of light, a gaping maw that threatened to swallow me whole. The flickering light was gone, but the static was still there, a palpable force that filled my mind, pressing down on me with its oppressive weight. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence. I should have turned back then. I should have run as fast as I could, but curiosity, That insidious beast had sunk its claws in deep. I walked up the overgrown path, the dry leaves whispering secrets as I passed, as if the very ground was alive. When I reached the front door, I saw it. A series of symbols carved into the wood. Not simply carved but etched, as if they had been seared into the door by some unholy force. The symbols were not of any language I recognized. They were ancient, alien, almost organic, pulsing with the same eerie luminescence as the static, as if they were connected to some kind of unseen network. They were not static. They shifted and twisted under my gaze, as if living entities trapped within the wood. They seemed to be calling me, whispering in a language that my mind could barely grasp. My hand moved on its own, reaching for the cold metal door handle. As my fingers brushed against it, a jolt of electricity shot up my arm, a searing pain that made me gasp and recoil. But the pull was too strong, the darkness too compelling. I pushed open the door, and a wave of cold, stale air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of decay, of dust, and of something indefinable, something that made my stomach churn. It was the smell of old blood, of ancient fears, of the abyss itself. The interior of the house was a void, a place where light and hope went to die. The darkness was oppressive, suffocating, as if it had a physical weight. The static was deafening now, a cacophony of noise that seemed to vibrate the very bones of my skull. I called out, my voice a weak, trembling thing. "Hello? Is anyone here?" The only reply was the relentless static, a mocking echo of my desperate plea. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began to make out the shapes of the furniture, old chairs draped with dusty sheets, a grandfather clock, its hands frozen forever at 3 minutes past 12, the witching hour, they say. A bookshelf was filled with tomes whose titles were obscured by dust and neglect, their spines cracked and brittle, as if they were centuries old. It seemed as if time had no meaning within these walls, that the past and the present were intermingled, locked in an eternal dance of decay. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of the past, a past that seemed both ancient and terrible. I moved deeper into the house, following the source of the static, which seemed to originate from the upstairs. Each step was more difficult than the last, my limbs feeling heavy, leaden. It was as if the house was trying to keep me in place. The stairs creaked and groaned under my feet, their sounds echoing through the oppressive silence. Reaching the landing, I saw it a single room, illuminated by the same faint, flickering light that I had seen from the street. The light was the color of dried blood. It felt wrong, sickening. I pushed open the door, and a gasp escaped my lips. The room was a twisted mockery of reality itself. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols that I had seen on the door, now glowing with an unnatural, pulsating luminescence, almost like veins filled with dark blood, as if the house itself was alive. In the center of the room stood an antique radio, not just any radio, but something ancient, something malevolent, its knobs and dials covered in a thick layer of dust. It was not just an object. It was a conduit, a gateway, a living, breathing thing that pulsed with the same unholy energy as the static. I approached the radio, my hand trembling uncontrollably. It seemed to be calling me, drawing me closer with an irresistible force. As my fingers touched one of the dials, the static erupted, a white-hot pain that felt like my brain was being ripped apart. And then the images. I saw them, not in my mind's eye, but as if they were being projected onto the back of my eyelids. Shadowy figures moved through the house, their forms indistinct and menacing, their eyes like empty sockets, burning with an unholy fire. I saw rituals performed under the pale light of the moon, sacrifices made in the name of something ancient and terrible, screams echoing through the corridors. I saw faces, twisted with pain and anguish, their eyes wide with terror, mouths contorted in silent screams, their souls forever trapped within the walls of this cursed place. And I saw myself, standing in the center of the room, my face blank and emotionless, as the static consumed me, as I became one with the darkness. The vision stopped, leaving me gasping for air, my mind reeling with the horror I had witnessed. I stumbled backward, tripping over something on the floor, I looked down and saw it, a small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. I picked it up, my hands shaking violently, and opened it. The script was spidery, uneven, as if the author had been in a state of near madness as he wrote. The static, it grows stronger every day. The gateway, they are coming. We must stop them. They feed on fear. The entries became more frantic, more incoherent, until they devolved into fragments and scribbles, culminating in a single, chilling phrase. The static has taken me. The last few pages were just smears of ink, as if the author had been dragged away or had finally succumbed. I dropped the journal, a wave of nausea washing over me. I felt like I was being suffocated, both by the static and the horrors that I had just seen. I knew that I had to get out. I had to escape this place before I became another one of its lost souls. I ran, my heart pounding against my ribs, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for breath, the cold night air burning in my lungs. But I knew that a part of me, a very important part of me, was still there, inside the house. Looking back at number 13, I could see it standing there, a dark, brooding silhouette, as silent and still as ever, but I knew that silence was a lie. I could still feel the static, deep inside me, an insidious hum that echoed the horrors that I had witnessed. It was a part of me now, a parasite that had burrowed deep into my soul. I tried to tell Liam, but he just looked at me like I was crazy, as if I were telling him some kind of fiction tale. He refused to believe me, even when I showed him the journal, claiming it was a theatrical prop. He was not alone in this. My other friends and family also acted in a similar fashion, and the worst of it all was the fact that I knew that they were starting to act strange, that their bodies were not moving as naturally as they did before, that their eyes seemed vacant and empty. I started to research, delving deeper into the history of the house, spending hours in the local library. It was then that I found that the house was built on an ancient Native American burial ground, a place where the veil between worlds was said to be thin. The Blackwood family, the last occupants, were said to have been involved in dark rituals, attempting to contact entities from another dimension. They used the radio to amplify their power, opening a gateway to a place of unimaginable darkness. The static, I realized, was not just a noise. It was a manifestation of this other realm, a bridge between worlds, and the more I listened, the more I was being pulled into it. The weeks turned into months, and the static grew stronger. It was becoming impossible to ignore, a constant hum that filled my every waking moment. My dreams were haunted by the shadowy figures, by the twisted faces, by the chilling whispers of the damned. It was as if the house was calling to me, beckoning me to return, to complete the ritual that had been started so long ago. I knew I was losing control, that I was becoming less myself, that I was slowly fading into the darkness. One night I went back. I had to. I was being drawn back like a moth to a flame. It was the 20th of December, just days before Christmas. The house looked even more menacing, its silhouette outlined against the pale glow of the moon. As I walked up the path, the static grew unbearable, the air itself thrumming with energy. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling. The symbols were glowing, brighter than before, as if they were welcoming me home. Stepping inside, I felt the cold embrace of the house, the suffocating darkness closing in around me. I walked to the room with the radio, drawn by the incessant hum, as if by an invisible thread. The room was pulsating, almost alive, and the radio was glowing with an unholy light, like a demonic heart. I saw the Blackwoods in my visions, their bodies twisting and contorting, their faces filled with the grotesque ecstasy of those who had given themselves over to the darkness. I felt myself reaching for the radio, my hand moving on its own, my will fading, as the static threatened to overwhelm me. But then I felt it, a spark of resistance, a flicker of my own will fighting against the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I pulled out the journal and, in a last act of defiance, I threw it into the heart of the radio. The radio began to scream, a high-pitched shriek that tore through the air. The symbols on the walls flickered and died, and the static began to subside, fading into a barely audible hum. The room itself seemed to shudder, the very fabric of reality shaking as the connection to the other realm was severed. For a moment, I felt it, the very essence of evil recoil. I ran from the house, not daring to look back, never stopping until I was far away, away from the darkness, away from the static. But the static, it never truly left me. It's always there, a constant hum that reminds me of the horrors I witnessed, the darkness I escaped. I still live in this town, and I still see the old house at the end of Ashwood Drive. Number 13. It's always there, lurking on the edge of my vision, a constant reminder of what lies hidden beneath the surface of our world, waiting for an opportunity to take us. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see the shadows move and hear the whispers of the damned. And I know that the static, it is always there, waiting for the moment it can break free, waiting to consume us all. Be aware of the static. Listen closely. It may already be inside you. And when it calls to you, you must resist with every ounce of your being. Or it will take you, and your soul will become nothing more than an echo of the void. Be aware, be vigilant, and always listen closely to the silence. For the static is always there. The old house stood on a hill overlooking the town, a jagged tooth against the pale sky. Its name was Blackwood Manor. It was a name whispered in hushed tones, a name that caused a cold dread to settle in the hearts of the townsfolk. People avoided it like a plague, their eyes wide with a fear that had been passed down through generations. They said it was cursed, tainted by the darkness, a place where sanity went to die. They told stories of strange lights and unsettling sounds, of disappearances and unspeakable horrors. No one dared to go near, for the house seemed to watch the town with its empty, soulless windows, a dark and brooding presence that cast a long, cold shadow over everything. The paint peeled from its walls like strips of dead skin, and the grass around it was always brown and brittle, as if the very earth rejected its existence. My name is Sarah, and I was a writer, drawn to the shadows and the stories they held. I loved the old tales, the ones that sent shivers down your spine, the ones that made you question the world around you. I was a skeptic, yes, but also a seeker, driven by a morbid curiosity. I wanted to find a real story, a story that would grip me and not let go. Blackwood Manor called to me with a strange, irresistible pull, like a dark magnet drawing me towards its embrace. It was like the house was whispering my name, a seductive and sinister invitation. It was a Tuesday, the second week of September, the leaves just beginning to turn, when I decided to finally answer the call. It was around 3 in the afternoon, the sun high in the sky, but the house seemed shrouded in a strange, unnatural shadow, as if it absorbed the light itself, a dark and silent void in the heart of the day. I walked up the long, winding path. The stones were cracked and uneven, loose beneath my feet, like the teeth of some ancient beast. The air was heavy and still, the silence broken only by the sound of my own breath and the crunch of my shoes on the gravel. Yet, I felt it, a strange coldness, a chilling presence that seemed to seep into my very bones. The front door loomed before me, large and imposing, made of heavy, dark wood, as if carved from the heart of a nightmare. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The metal handle rusted and cold to the touch. I pushed it, the door groaning and creaking open as if in protest, and a gust of stale air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of dust and decay, of mold and rot, and something else, something sickly sweet and metallic, like old blood and burnt sugar, a smell that made my stomach churn. It was the smell of death. The hallway stretched before me, long and narrow, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. It was hard to see, as if the light itself refused to enter. The air was thick and heavy, almost palpable, a choking presence that pressed against my lungs. The smell of dust and rot was overpowering, mixing with that strange, sickly sweetness, creating a nauseating cocktail. I heard a sound, a whisper, so soft I almost imagined it. It was barely audible, like the rustling of dry leaves or the sigh of a dying wind. But I felt it, a vibration deep in my chest. I couldn't make out the words, but it seemed to be coming from all around, from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, as if the house itself was whispering to me. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart hammering against my ribs, and the floorboards groaned under my weight, like the bones of some ancient creature protesting my intrusion. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, seemed to be calling my name, a seductive and sinister lure. I entered the living room. It was vast and imposing, a cavernous space that seemed to swallow the light. A huge stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and empty, its hearth filled with the dust of centuries. A large table stood in the center of the room, covered in a thick layer of dust, surrounded by chairs draped with white cloths that seemed to sway in an unseen breeze, like restless spirits waiting to be awakened. It looked like no one had set foot in this room for ages, yet the air felt heavy and expectant, as if something was waiting to happen. The whispers surrounded me, a chorus of voices chanting my name, some high and shrill, others low and guttural, some pleading, others taunting. They were coming from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied chorus that seemed to seep into my very soul. I walked toward the fireplace, the floorboards creaking loudly with every step, each groan a protest. I touched the stones, they were cold and damp, almost slimy to the touch, and I pulled my hand back quickly, repulsed by their clammy feel. I looked up into the chimney. It was a dark and empty tunnel, a gaping hole leading to some unknown abyss, a black void that seemed to swallow all light and hope. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. They were saying my name, faster and faster, repeating it over and over again, as if trying to summon me. I looked around, trying to find their source, but I was alone. Just me, the house, and the whispers. I went up the stairs, each step a struggle, my body feeling heavier, as if the house itself was pulling me down. The stairs groaned and creaked under my weight, as if they were protesting my ascent, the wood complaining and splintering like bones breaking under pressure. I reached the second floor, and the long hallway stretched before me, each door a mystery, a potential gateway to something terrible. I tried the first door. It was locked, the handle unyielding, cold, and smooth as bone. I tried the second door. It opened with a slow, protesting groan, the hinges squealing like a tortured animal. I stepped inside. It was a bedroom, dark and dusty, with a strange, unsettling stillness. A large bed stood in the center, covered with yellowed and stained white sheets that felt like cold, clammy skin. A dresser sat against one wall, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, and on the wall hung an old mirror, cracked and dirty, its surface dull and distorted. I looked into it, and I saw my reflection, pale and scared, and then I saw something else, something moving behind me, a dark and formless shape that seemed to writhe and twist in the air. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there, just the empty room, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. I turned back to the mirror, and the dark shape was gone, leaving behind only my pale, frightened reflection. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices chanting my name, echoing and distorting, as if coming from deep inside the house and my own skull. I quickly left the bedroom, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The image of the dark shape burned in my mind. I moved to the next door, and it opened without a sound, as if it had been waiting for me. This bedroom was different from the others. The walls were covered in strange drawings, crude and disturbing images of twisted, grotesque figures that seemed to writhe in agony, their faces contorted in silent screams. They were like a nightmare made flesh, a gruesome vision of human suffering. An old book lay open on the floor, its pages yellowed and brittle, and I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling as they brushed against its cold, leathery cover. The book was old and worn, bound in dark leather that had become cracked and dry with age. The pages were yellowed and brittle, and the writing was in a strange, angular script that I couldn't understand, symbols and characters from a forgotten language, like the whispers made visible on paper. There were illustrations throughout the book, dark and disturbing images of unspeakable acts, of ancient rituals and dark ceremonies, of sacrifices and tortures, of faces twisted in terror and agony. The images sent a shiver down my spine, the air in the room growing colder, and I felt a sense of dread wash over me, a heavy and suffocating weight on my chest. The whispers became a chorus, a cacophony of voices chanting my name, growing louder and more insistent, as if urging me to embrace the darkness that surrounded me. I quickly left that disturbing bedroom. The images from the book burned into my memory, the language like a dark mantra playing in my mind. I went to the next room. It was a bathroom, and the air was heavy with a strange, cloying sweetness. There was an old porcelain bathtub, and it was filled with black water. The water was still like a dark, unmoving pool, but it was also moving, as if something was stirring beneath the surface, and it looked like it was pulsing, almost breathing. I didn't dare to touch it, repulsed by its oily surface, and I heard a sound, a giggle, a high-pitched, childish giggle, but it was wrong. It was mocking and cruel, sending chills down my spine, the sound seeming to echo from deep within the water itself. I fled from the bathroom, my heart pounding in my chest, and I went to the next room. It was a study, and the air was thick with the scent of old paper and ink. Books were scattered everywhere, piled high on shelves, strewn across the floor, stacked precariously on the desk. A large map hung on the wall, a map of the house, but it was wrong. It was a distorted representation of reality. It showed rooms that didn't exist, hallways that twisted into impossible shapes, and secret passages that seemed to lead to nowhere. It was as if the house was trying to confuse me, to disorient me, to trap me in its labyrinthine depths. I touched the desk. It was cold and smooth, like polished stone, and I saw a piece of paper, a letter, yellowed with age and covered in faded writing. It was dated August the 15th, 1971. It was from a man named Thomas. He wrote of the house and how the walls were whispering to him, how it seemed to be breathing around him, that it wanted something from him, something terrible, and how the house made him afraid. He wrote that he was going to try to leave, but I could feel it, a cold sense of dread washing over me, that he never made it out. I could feel his fear, and it had become my own. I put the letter back on the desk, my fingers trembling, and I felt a cold breath on my neck, like a whisper of ice, and I spun around, but there was nothing there. The whispers were louder now. They seemed to be all around me. They were inside my head. They were like voices, many voices, all speaking at once, all saying different things, all chanting my name. They were a symphony of madness, a chorus of the damned. I fled from the study, my mind reeling, my senses overwhelmed, and I ran down the stairs, each step clumsy and uneven, my body shaking with fear. I reached the front door. I tried to open it, but it was locked, the handle refusing to turn, as if the house was determined to keep me captive. I pulled on the handle. I pushed against the wood, but it wouldn't budge. The door seemed to mock my desperate attempts to escape. The whispers grew louder. They weren't whispers anymore. They were screams, they were shrieks. They were filled with pain and fury, and I felt like I was losing my mind, like my sanity was slipping away, like I was falling apart piece by piece. I turned around, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and I saw something moving in the hallway, a shadow, tall and thin, and it seemed to be made of pure darkness. It seemed to glide across the floor, as if it was floating, its form shifting and distorting as it approached. It was a void, an absence of light, and I couldn't see a face, just blackness, like a hole in reality. It didn't make a sound, but I felt its presence, a cold and terrifying power, and it moved closer, closer, closer. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry and tight, as if I had swallowed sand. I tried to move, but my legs were like lead, and they would not obey. The shadow came closer, 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 and I could feel its cold breath on my face. It reached out a hand, long and spindly, like a bone, and it touched my face, and its touch was like ice. It felt like death itself, and I felt my soul being sucked away. The whispers grew louder, and then everything went black, the darkness swallowing me whole. I woke up on the floor of the living room, the air still and oppressive. It was the same room, yet it was different. The white cloths were gone from the chairs. They sat empty and still, as if mocking my defeat. A fire burned in the fireplace, but it was a strange, unnatural fire, with flames that pulsed and shifted like living things, offering no warmth, just a sense of unease and dread. The whispers were gone. The house was silent, but it was a silence that felt heavy and watchful, a silence that screamed. I tried the front door again, and it opened without a sound, a silent invitation, a mocking gesture. I ran outside, not stopping until I was far away from Blackwood Manor, away from its darkness and its silence. I looked back at the house, and it looked the same as before, dark, silent, and watchful, a monument to forgotten sins and unspeakable horrors. But I knew that it wasn't silent. I knew it was still waiting, and I knew it was still hungry, and I knew that it would call me again, and I wouldn't be able to resist. I went back home, but I couldn't find peace. I couldn't find rest. I tried to forget about Blackwood Manor. I tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, but I knew it wasn't. I kept hearing the whispers, inside my head. They wouldn't leave me alone. They were always there, a constant, insidious hum. I kept seeing the shadow, always at the corner of my vision, always lurking in my dreams, a dark and terrifying presence that followed me everywhere. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, and I was always on edge, always watching over my shoulder, always waiting for the house to call me back. I went to the library, and I delved deeper into the history of Blackwood Manor, trying to find some explanation, some way to escape the house's grasp, some defense against the darkness. I found old books, old maps, and old stories, and they revealed a chilling history. And the books said the house was built upon an ancient burial ground, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and maps showed secret tunnels that ran deep beneath the house, and stories spoke of dark rituals and unspeakable acts that had been committed within its walls. I learned that the house was alive, that it had a will of its own, and it fed on the fear and despair of those who entered its doors, and it used the whispers to lure them into its grasp, to consume their souls and add them to its collection. I learned more about the Blackwood family, that they were strange and cruel, that they were obsessed with the occult, that they had performed dark rituals and had tried to control the house, to harness its power. But they had failed, and they had all died terrible deaths, and their spirits were trapped within the house, and they had become the whispers and the shadows and the horrors that waited to greet those foolish enough to enter. They were now a part of the house. They were the house. I knew I had to go back. I knew I couldn't resist. The house was calling me. I went back to Blackwood Manor on a Saturday, 2 weeks after my first visit. The sky was gray and overcast, the air heavy and still, and the house looked darker and more menacing than ever before, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the void. I didn't want to go inside, but I had no choice. The whispers were too strong, the pull of the house was too powerful. I felt like I was no longer myself, that I was just a puppet being pulled by invisible strings, that I had become a part of the house, and there was no turning back. I walked up the path, the stones even looser than before, as if they were trying to trip me, as if they were rejecting me, but my legs continued to move of their own accord. I went inside, and the hallway was dark, and the whispers started again. Immediately, and this time, they were not just whispers, they were like a song, a dark and twisted melody, a lullaby from the abyss, and they seemed to pull me forward, to guide my steps, and I walked as if in a dream, my mind clouded, my body moving without my consent, as if I was a ghost haunting my own life. I went into the living room, and it was different again. The fireplace was gone, the table was gone, the chairs were gone, the room was completely empty, and the walls were moving, they were breathing, they were pulsing and throbbing like living flesh, and the whispers were louder now, they were chanting my name in unison. They were like faces emerging from the walls, distorted and grotesque, and they were laughing at me, mocking my despair, and they were waiting for me, eager to welcome me home. I went towards the stairs, but they were gone, and in their place was a hole in the floor, a black and gaping hole that seemed to lead down into an abyss, and I jumped, I fell, and I landed in another room, and it was the bathroom, and the tub was still full of black water, bubbling and churning as if something was waiting to surface, and the giggle was louder now, more menacing than ever, and it was coming from the water. It was like a child's giggle, but it was cruel and mocking, and it sent chills down my spine. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't, my legs would not move, and I felt like I was being held captive. My will was no longer my own. My mind was now a playground for the whispers, and I turned and ran, but it was a futile effort, and I ran back to the hole, and I jumped down, and I was back in the hallway. The front door was right in front of me, and for a brief moment I saw it, a chance for escape, and I ran towards it, but it was locked again, and the shadows were all around me now. They were growing and multiplying, and they seemed to be closing in, trapping me in their embrace. I felt something grab my hand. It was cold and clammy, like the hand of a corpse, and it pulled me back into the hallway, and the shadows were all around me now, and they seemed to be closing in, and I could hear the whispers singing, and they were singing my name, and they were saying, "You are home now. You belong to us now. You are one of us now." I looked back at the front door, and it was gone, and the wall was smooth and featureless, and I was trapped. There was no escape. I was lost to the house, forever. I tried to fight, but I was too weak. I had no strength left, and the shadows were too strong, and they closed in around me, and I felt them touch me, and it was cold and painful, and I felt myself fading away, my thoughts becoming jumbled and incoherent, and all I could hear were the whispers, and they were consuming me, and I was no longer myself, and I was part of the house now. I am writing this now, and I do not know how, I do not know where I am, for I am no longer Sarah, and I am now the house, I am the whispers, I am the shadows, I am the darkness, and the house is calling for you. The house is always hungry. Come to Blackwood Manor, and we are waiting. And you will never be alone again, and we have many stories to tell, and more. You will become one of us, and your soul will become an echo in this darkness, and the house will consume you. The whispers grow louder, they never stop, and it is my name they sing, and it is my story you now know, and now the house is calling you just like it did to me. The house is waiting, always waiting, and now you will come join us, and you will become one of us, and you will know what it is to be the whispers and the shadows and the darkness, and then you will understand everything. The woods were ancient, a place of twisted secrets and forgotten terrors. They were called the Black Pines, and the name itself was a curse, a whispered warning that carried a chilling weight. People in the town avoided them, their eyes wide with a primal fear, their voices hushed as they spoke of the strange things that happened within their depths, the unsettling sounds, and the disappearances that had haunted the area for generations. They said the trees were not natural, that the woods were a gateway to something dark and malevolent. The trees were unnaturally tall, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky, blocking out the sun and plunging the forest floor into a perpetual twilight. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the suffocating scent of decaying pine needles and something else, a metallic odor like rust and ozone, sharp and unsettling, like the smell of a machine that had been left to rot. My name is Mark, and I was a hiker, an explorer, a seeker of the unknown. I loved to challenge myself, to venture into places where others feared to tread. I was a skeptic, a man of reason, and I dismissed the stories about the Black Pines as mere superstition, the product of overactive imaginations and a fear of the dark. I was drawn to them, a pull, an irresistible force that I couldn't explain, a morbid curiosity that felt like a dark hunger. I decided to go to the Black Pines on a Saturday in late October, when the trees were dressed in the dying hues of autumn, their leaves a mix of faded yellows and browns, rustling in the cold wind. It was around 10 o'clock in the morning, and the sky was overcast, the sun hidden behind a heavy gray blanket. The air was cold and carried a sharp bite, and it felt as if the woods were watching, waiting, anticipating my arrival. I parked my car on the side of the road, the tires crunching on the loose gravel, the engine sputtering and falling silent, and I stepped into the woods. The trees towered above me, their branches intertwining, forming a dense canopy that completely blocked out the sky, making the darkness feel absolute. The silence was unnerving, felt like the woods were holding its breath. I couldn't hear birds, or the wind rustling through the leaves, or any of the normal sounds of nature. There was only an oppressive stillness, a silence that felt unnatural, heavy and expectant. Too quiet. Felt like I had stepped into a soundproof room. I walked deeper into the woods, my boots crunching on the carpet of pine needles, and the trees grew more dense, their trunks pressing close together, and their branches reaching out like claws, making it hard to see and making the path disappear before me. As I moved forward, I started to see strange things. The trees seemed different, their bark unnaturally smooth and cold to the touch, like polished metal, and some of them seemed to shimmer, their surfaces reflecting the dim light in strange, distorted ways. Their branches were too straight, too precise, and their shapes were like geometric patterns, like something designed by an engineer not grown naturally. The forest felt alien, wrong, as if I had stepped into a simulation. I felt a strange disorientation, a creeping dread, and I knew that these woods were not natural. They were something else entirely, something broken. I heard a sound, a low and persistent buzz, like the hum of electricity, and it seemed to be coming from everywhere. I looked around but saw nothing but the strange trees, their metallic surfaces reflecting the dim light, and the buzz grew louder and a strange tingling sensation ran across my skin, like the hairs on my body were standing on end, and I felt like something was watching me, something unseen, something malevolent, something not human. I felt it in my blood, in my bones. I kept walking. I tried to ignore the fear, pushing forward, and I saw a light in the distance, a pale, white glow cutting through the darkness, and it was pulling me in, an irresistible force. It was not sunlight, but a cold, sterile radiance, like a light from a machine. The trees grew more distorted, their shapes becoming increasingly bizarre. Some of them resembled wires and pipes, others were like twisted metal sculptures, and it was as if nature itself was breaking apart, or as if the woods were malfunctioning, glitching. The buzz was deafening, and my skin felt like it was vibrating, as if my body was resonating with some strange energy, and the ground felt strange, unsteady beneath my feet. It felt like it was moving, shifting, and pulsating, and it was hard to walk, like I was walking in slow motion, and I felt disconnected from reality, disoriented, like I was trapped in a nightmare. Time itself seemed to become distorted, as minutes felt like hours, and hours like mere seconds. I reached the light, and it was a clearing, a circular space in the middle of the woods, and in the center of that clearing stood a metal structure, like a tower, a massive, imposing structure, and it was white and shiny, reflecting the strange light around it, and it was covered in wires, lights, and strange symbols that seemed to flicker and shift as I looked at them, and it didn't belong there. It was alien, unnatural, like a machine from another world. It was humming, a low and persistent hum that vibrated through my very bones, and I knew it was the source of everything, the source of the buzz, the source of the fear, and the source of the broken reality I had stumbled into. I walked closer to the tower, and the hum grew louder, and I felt dizzy, my head throbbing with pain, and the air felt heavy and thick. It was like a pressure pushing down on me, and I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My body felt heavy, and the tower was pulling me in, and my will was no longer my own, and I reached out and touched it, my hand brushing against the cold, smooth metal. It felt like glass, and the hum grew louder, and I saw a flash of white light, and everything went black. Complete and utter nothing. I was not in the woods anymore. I was somewhere else, and it was like the woods, but it was wrong, twisted, a reflection of the pines, made of metal and wire. The trees were made of metal, and the ground was gray metal, and the sky was dark, with a strange in-between light, and the air was cold, like the inside of a refrigerator, and the hum was still there everywhere, a constant vibration, and time seemed to shift and distort around me. I felt an overwhelming sense of unreality, as if the world itself was broken. I saw a figure in the distance, moving slowly, and it was tall and thin, not human. It had long, spindly arms and a small, featureless head. Its body made of metal and wires. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a broken machine. His body seemed to click and hum and vibrate. It was like a glitch, a broken image, a nightmare made real. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey, and the figure came closer, moving with unnerving speed, gliding silently across the metal landscape, and it stopped in front of me, and I was paralyzed with fear, and I looked at its face, and there was nothing there, just a smooth metallic surface, like a mirror reflecting my own fear back at me. I could see its body clearly, and it was a machine, but it was also alive, and its wires were moving, and its parts were clicking, and it reached out a hand, long and thin, made of cold, hard metal, and it touched my arm, and I felt a shock, a surge of energy that ripped through me, and I felt like my body was breaking apart, like I was dissolving into something else, and as the touch continued, I felt my identity slipping away, my memories fragmenting, and my thoughts becoming jumbled and confused, and the hum grew louder, deafening, and I saw colors, not normal colors, but distorted and shifting hues, all at once, and I fell into the darkness, losing all sense of myself. I woke up and I was back in the clearing. The metal tower was still there, humming, and the trees looked the same, twisted and strange, but I felt different, wrong, as if something had been changed inside of me, as if a part of myself had been ripped away and replaced by something alien. I was broken, infected. I looked at my arm, and the black line was there, burned into my skin, cold and numb to the touch, and when I touched it, I felt a strange buzz, the same buzz from the woods, and I knew that a part of the tower was now inside me, a dark and unwelcome addition. Felt like the tower was draining me. I got up, my body feeling heavy and weak, and I walked away from the tower, and the hum grew quieter, but it was still there inside me, and I walked back, but the trees were still strange, and the ground was still moving, and the woods were still not real, a distorted reflection of the natural world. I felt like I was slowly becoming part of it. I reached my car, my fingers fumbling on the keys, and I got inside and drove away, and I looked back at the woods, and they looked the same, dark and silent. But I knew they were not silent, they were still waiting, and I knew they were still calling to me, and I knew that the woods were not normal, they were a glitch in reality, and the glitch was spreading. I drove home, but I felt strange, detached, as if I was a ghost haunting my own life, and I kept looking at my arm. The black line was still there, growing wider, and I felt the buzz, and I knew I was no longer myself. Something was taking over, and I was losing control. My thoughts became fragmented, and I found myself drawn back to the woods, to the tower, as if I was a puppet on a string. I could not resist. I tried to forget about the woods, I tried to live a normal life, but it was impossible. I kept seeing the trees and the tower and the figure in my dreams, and I kept feeling the hum inside me, and I knew that I was being called back. A part of me belonged to those broken woods now. I went back to the woods 1 week later on a Sunday around midday, and the sky was overcast, the air cold, and the woods looked darker, the trees more twisted, the buzz was louder, and I walked into the woods, drawn by the irresistible force, the magnetic pull, and I walked to the clearing. The metal tower was there, and I touched it, and the hum grew louder, and the flash of white light came, and I was no longer in the woods. I was back in the metal world. The trees were twisted metal, the ground was gray, the sky was dark, and the figure was moving towards me, and it touched my arm, and the shock came back, and I saw the colors, and I fell. I woke up, but I was different. The clearing was still there, and the tower was still there, but the trees looked more broken, the ground felt unstable, and the tower hummed weaker, and I looked at my arm, and the black line was bigger, and the buzz was stronger, and I felt like I was becoming part of the woods, part of the glitch, and it was taking control. I was no longer myself. I tried to leave, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. The trees were closing in around me, and the ground was cracking, and the air was heavy. It was hard to breathe, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped. I could feel myself fading away. The hum was all I could hear. It was growing louder, and I felt the glitch was consuming me. My memories were fading. My thoughts were no longer my own. I saw the figure, and it was moving towards me, and it reached out a hand, a wire, and it touched my face, and the shock came, and it felt like my body was being torn apart, my identity fading away, and the colors were everywhere, and I fell into them, becoming one with the broken woods, one with the glitch, and the hum was the last thing I heard before everything went dark, and my consciousness faded away. I am writing this now, and I do not know where I am, and I do not know how, for I am no longer Mark, I am not human, I am part of the glitch. I am the woods, I am the metal trees, I am the humming, I am the figure, I am the black line, and I am everything and nothing. I am broken, and I am spreading. The code is in me now. The woods are calling to you. They are always calling. The glitch is spreading, and it is everywhere. Come to the black pines, and we are waiting. You will become one of us, and you will become one with the glitch. You will know the truth. You will know the code. The woods are broken, and they are breaking everything, and they are calling you, and you will answer. For you are already becoming one of us. You will never be alone again, and you are already broken. The wind, a tormented soul, wailed around Blackwood Point, a symphony of despair that had echoed through the ages. The lighthouse, a skeletal finger pointing at the heavens, stood defiant against the encroaching sea, its weathered stones bearing the scars of forgotten tempests. Silas, the keeper, a man carved from the same granite as the cliffs, was a living embodiment of solitude. His eyes, like obsidian shards, held the secrets of the deep, and his beard, a tangled mass of gray, seemed to whisper forgotten tales on the wind. The townsfolk of Oakhaven, a collection of fragile houses huddled at the base of the cliffs, called him tide-touched, a harmless madman who spoke with the gulls. But they felt a prickle of unease whenever his shadow fell upon them, a recognition that he knew something they didn't, a secret the sea had shared only with him. They feared the sea, they feared the lighthouse, and they feared the silence that fell when the fog rolled in. It was the eve of the 21st of March, 1972. The air hung heavy, thick with a pregnant stillness, like the pause before a scream. The fog, a spectral tide, began its relentless march from the sea, its tendrils reaching out like ghostly hands, devouring the world in its clammy embrace. Silas felt it, not as a change in the weather, but as a presence, a cold touch on his soul. He had felt this dread before, in the darkest hours of the night, when the moans of the forgotten echoed on the wind, a siren song of the abyss. That night, the sea serpent, captained by Thomas Hemlock, a young man whose heart beat with the rhythm of the waves, was due back to Oakhaven. But as the hours bled into an endless night, the fog thickened, the sea roared like a beast in torment, and the light of the lighthouse became a pathetic, flickering candle in the swirling gray. The sea serpent was gone, vanished without a trace, taking with it 5 souls, swallowed whole by the ravenous maw of the sea. And with it, a piece of Oakhaven was lost forever. The next morning, the sun rose with the sickly pallor of a corpse, but the fog clung to the cliffs like a shroud. No wreckage, no sign of the sea serpent, only a gaping hole in the soul of Oakhaven. Old Man Hemlock, Thomas's father, his face a mask of grief and madness, swore he had heard a chorus of whispers carried on the wind, voices calling from the depths of the fog, and a low, agonizing moan coming from the lighthouse. But the others turned away, their fear making them deaf to the truth. They buried their fear and grief deep within themselves, hoping it would eventually just go away. It wouldn't. The weeks that followed were punctuated by a growing sense of unease. Oakhaven, once a place of simple routines, was slowly transforming into a nightmare. The fishermen stayed ashore, their boats rotting on the sand. The children played in hushed whispers, their games mirroring the growing unease in their hearts. The adults moved with a haunted, fearful caution, the lines on their faces deepening with each passing day. And then, on the 7th of April, the darkness took hold. The children began to have nightmares, vivid and terrifying visions that spilled into their waking hours. They saw shadowy figures emerging from the fog, their eyes burning like embers, their skin slick and cold, their whispers like the scraping of claws on stone. Mrs. Gable, the baker, whose hands once kneaded dough with a gentle touch, found strange symbols carved into her flour sacks, symbols that seemed to writhe and twist, symbols that brought with them a cold, numbing dread. Mr. Abernathy, the town's clockmaker, discovered his meticulously crafted clocks running backward, time itself bending and breaking under the weight of the fog. These small signs were like cracks in the veneer of reality, letting something terrible seep into their lives. Thomas, a boy who was both blessed and cursed with an overactive imagination, felt the wrongness in his bones. He saw the fear that was eating away at his town. He spent his days by the sea, drawn to the melancholy cries of the gulls, seeking answers in the ceaseless crash of waves. He knew that this was not just a tragedy. This was something ancient, something evil that was awakening in Oakhaven. And the heart of this evil, he was sure, lay within the silent, brooding shadow of the lighthouse. He shared his fears with Martha and Samuel, his 2 closest companions, kindred spirits who saw the world with the same unsettling clarity. They were afraid, yes, but they were also children of Oakhaven, bound to their home by a sense of belonging and by a growing sense of dread. On the 29th of April, they decided that they would face the darkness that had enveloped their town. It was a quest born out of desperation, a fragile spark of courage in the face of an overwhelming abyss. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of blood and bruised flesh, Thomas, Martha, and Samuel set out towards the lighthouse. The path that led to it was overgrown with thorns and choked with shadows, as if the land itself was trying to keep them away. As they climbed, the fog thickened, pressing in on them, muffling their footsteps, and carrying with it the faint smell of salt and decay. They reached the lighthouse around 9 o'clock. The door, a massive oak slab bound with rusted iron, hung open, as if inviting them into the abyss. The air within was heavy and cold, like a tomb. A strange, metallic scent, mixed with the odor of brine and something ancient, made their stomachs churn. Thomas's hand trembled as he pushed the door further open and called out, his voice barely above a whisper, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Only silence answered, a silence that was more terrifying than any sound. They took a tentative step inside, the darkness closing in around them. The spiral staircase that led to the lantern room loomed before them, each step worn smooth by the tread of countless feet, both living and dead. As they ascended, they noticed the walls, previously of bare stone, now covered with fishbone symbols, scratched into the stone with something sharp and desperate. The symbols pulsed with a faint, black light, as if they were alive, as if they were watching them. Thomas reached out to touch one and felt a jolt of icy cold, a sensation like the touch of a dead hand. They reached the lantern room. The scene that unfolded before them was a grotesque tableau. Silas stood with his back to them, facing the wall, his body contorted in a grotesque parody of prayer. He was chanting in a low, guttural tongue that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. His back was bare, his skin covered in fresh fishbone symbols, from which a black, tar-like substance oozed and dripped, staining the stone floor with its viscous trail. It smelled of death, and something even older than death. Thomas gasped, his heart pounding against his ribs. This wasn't just an old man, a hermit. This was a vessel, a conduit for something terrible. Silas turned slowly, his eyes now black pits that seemed to swallow the light. The flesh around his mouth twisted into a ghastly smile as he opened it, and the sound that emerged was not human. A guttural moan, a grating sound like bones scraping against stone, a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of their being. It was the same moan Old Man Hemlock had heard after the sea serpent was swallowed by the fog. The children didn't wait. They turned and fled, their screams lost in the oppressive silence of the fog. They tumbled down the stairs, out the door, and into the suffocating embrace of the night. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of their homes, their bodies trembling, their minds reeling. But even in the safety of their homes, they could still hear that sound in their ears, a constant, horrifying reminder of what they had seen. Thomas, sleep-deprived and haunted, could not shake the vision of Silas's empty eyes. He knew the adults wouldn't believe him. They never did. But he also knew that he couldn't stay silent. He had to warn someone, even if that meant facing their disbelief and ridicule. The next day, Thomas shared his terrifying experience with Martha and Samuel. They believed him because they had seen it with their own eyes. They knew that what they had witnessed was real. They knew the evil was spreading. On the 3rd of May, they returned to the lighthouse, armed not with weapons, but with a fragile determination to understand what was happening to their home. This time, the door to the lighthouse stood wide open, as if beckoning them into the very heart of the darkness. The air within was colder, thicker, and more oppressive than before. The silence was palpable, a suffocating weight that pressed down on them from all sides. They called out, their voices trembling, and only the echoing whispers answered them. They began their ascent, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. When they reached the lantern room, Silas was gone. But the room had changed again. The glass of the lantern was cracked and shattered. The black, viscous substance dripped down its sides, staining the floor and walls. The floor itself was covered in a layer of black sand, a substance that seemed to drink the light, leaving the room in a perpetual twilight. In the center of the black sand, there was a circle drawn with disturbing precision, and inside the circle, something pulsed with a dark and terrible energy. It was a fish, but like no fish they had ever seen. Its scales were jagged, like obsidian shards. Its eyes were milky white, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with row upon row of needle-like teeth. It was not moving in a conventional sense, but it was vibrating, pulsing with a low, humming sound that seemed to resonate in their very bones. A sound like the grinding of rock on rock, mixed with the mournful cries of the sea. It was the sound that Old Man Hemlock had heard. It was the sound of the souls consumed by the fog. The children backed away, their terror a tangible presence. Then the fish opened its mouth not to bite, but to speak. A chorus of whispers, 1,000 voices mingling into one, emerged from its maw, saying, "The tide is coming. You are all welcome home." It was an invitation, a promise, and a chilling prophecy. The children fled once more, their minds shattered by the horror of what they had seen. They ran until they were safe in their homes, their faces white with fear. But they knew the darkness had spread too far. They knew Oakhaven was lost. That night, the fog returned, thicker and darker than ever before. It came not only with the sound of the sea and the wind, but with a mournful, desperate howling that echoed from the depths of the fog, the sound of thousands of tortured souls crying out in despair. And when the fog finally lifted, Oakhaven was no more. People were gone. Houses stood empty. Possessions were scattered on the streets. It was as if the tide had come and swept everything away. The only sounds were the wind, the waves, and the whispers carried by the fog. The few who remained huddled in fear, their eyes wide with terror, whispering of the lighthouse, of the fish, and of the fog. They whispered that the lighthouse was not just a landmark, but a gateway, a portal to something else entirely, and that the sea was hungry, that it would always be hungry. Years passed, decades turned into centuries, and the story of Oakhaven became a legend, a terrifying whisper that haunted the coast. Blackwood Point was avoided like a cursed land, the lighthouse a dark sentinel watching over the bones of the town. And the sea continued to crash against the cliffs, its voice a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of the world. Then, on the 10th of June, 2021, a group of urban explorers, drawn to the darkness, came to Oakhaven. They had heard the stories, dismissed them as myths and legends, and believed they were immune to the horror that lurked within the abandoned lighthouse. They were wrong. They were fools. They arrived at Blackwood Point just before midnight, and, like so many before them, they found the door open, as if inviting them in. They entered the lighthouse and climbed the stairs, their laughter echoing in the night. They were not laughing when they reached the lantern room and saw the fish. Ethan, one of the explorers, reached out to touch it. He believed it was all a hoax, a setup. But his fingers, the moment they made contact with the fish, found something else entirely. Something cold, something sharp, something ancient. The fish opened its mouth and spoke with 1,000 voices. "The tide is here. You are all home now." Chaos, screams, and then silence. The last anyone ever heard of them was a short video recovered from one of their cameras. The video shows terror, fear, and then blackness. Then silence. Just like always, the lighthouse still stands, a silent, menacing monument against the endless gray of the sea. The fog still rolls in, and the whispers on the wind carry the message of the darkness. A chilling reminder that some doors are best left unopened, that some secrets should never be revealed, that sometimes the things we fear most are real. The tide is always coming. It is patient and it is hungry, and it will always find its way home. And this time you are home. The old clock in the town square, a towering monolith of blackened stone, always struck 13 times at midnight. The sound, a dissonant, bone-chilling cacophony, was less a chime and more a mournful dirge that seemed to seep into the very marrow of Blackwood, a small town cradled in the embrace of ancient, whispering woods. The clock, a relic of forgotten ages, stood as a silent, obsidian sentinel, its surface reflecting not the gentle light of the moon, but the spectral fears that lurked just beneath the surface of reality. It had been there for over 200 years, a malevolent tumor on the face of the town, a constant reminder of a dark pact sealed in shadows and whispers. The townsfolk, descendants of those who had first settled in the shadow of the clock, had learned to live with its unnerving peculiarity, to bury the dread it inspired deep beneath the facade of ordinary life, like a festering wound concealed by a fragile bandage. The clock was rumored to have been built by a man named Silas, a recluse who had dwelled in the gnarled woods that edged the town, his existence as twisted and overgrown as the ancient trees themselves. He was not merely an eccentric. He was a pariah, a conduit for something ancient and unholy. Locals spoke of him in hushed, fearful whispers, like uttering an incantation that could summon him from the depths of the woods. They whispered of dark rites performed under the pallid moon, of sacrifices made to entities that dwelled beyond the veil of mortal perception. Silas collected not just bones, but the remnants of forgotten rituals, the petrified remains of creatures that defied earthly explanation. He collected old, decaying maps of places that had slipped from the world's memory, their coordinates leading not to cities, but to the liminal spaces where reality began to fray. And he collected glass bottles filled with viscous, iridescent fluids that pulsed with a life not of this world, their glow casting eerie shadows that seemed to writhe with sentience. It was said that Silas never slept, that he stalked the woods under the cover of night, his eyes glowing with a cold, predatory luminescence, like a hunter seeking his prey in the labyrinth of the darkness. One humid summer night, under a sky thick with unseen stars, a group of teenagers, fueled by a potent cocktail of youthful arrogance and a desperate craving for something more than the mundane, decided to venture into the woods towards Silas's derelict cabin. They were not motivated by malice, but by a strange mixture of dread and fascination, the irresistible pull of the forbidden, like moths drawn to a flickering flame. The cabin was not merely abandoned. It was a shell, an echo of its former self, its door hanging askew as if beckoning them into its maw. The air inside was heavy and still, thick with the cloying scent of damp earth and decay. The floor was covered in intricate patterns, not simply drawn, but carved into the wood, the grooves filled with a dark, crimson substance that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, like fresh blood. These patterns were not of this world. They were a language not meant for human eyes, a series of symbols that seemed to shift and writhe with a life of their own, their meaning eluding human understanding. One of the teenagers, a girl named Sarah, a young woman with a razor-sharp intellect and an almost pathological need to dissect and analyze the world around her, touched one of the patterns. It was an act not of recklessness, but of calculated curiosity, an attempt to categorize and understand the unsettling darkness that permeated the cabin. She later described feeling a sudden, bone-deep cold, as if a shard of ice had pierced her heart, a chilling caress that seemed to seep into her soul, a harbinger of the horrors that awaited her. From that moment on, the world around her seemed to tilt on its axis, her perception of reality fractured and distorted. After that night, Sarah began to perceive the world through a different lens, her senses heightened and warped. Shadows moved not just in her peripheral vision, but danced and pulsed with an unsettling life of their own, transforming familiar shapes into grotesque, monstrous figures. She heard whispers on the wind, not just the rustling of leaves, but hushed voices speaking her name in a multitude of tongues, calling to her from the depths of the woods and the darkness beyond, their tones a mixture of seduction and malice. The 13 chimes of the town clock became a nightmarish obsession, a haunting symphony of dread that seemed to echo in her thoughts, the individual notes sharp and distorted, like the teeth of a monstrous beast grinding in the silence. The clock was not just a timepiece, but an instrument of torture, a malevolent force that seemed to tug at her mind, beckoning her closer to its dark heart. She delved into the town's history, her research becoming an all-consuming quest, her days and nights blurring into a frantic search for answers. She found Silas's diary, a leather-bound tome that felt cold to the touch, its pages filled with chaotic scrawls, half-formed sentences, and chilling references to a place beyond the veil of reality, a realm known as the other side. The diary was a descent into madness, a terrifying glimpse into a broken mind that had gazed too long into the abyss. In its pages, Silas spoke of a door, a portal between worlds, which he believed could be opened through the power of the town clock, the 13 chimes acting as a key, a vibrational sequence that could tear a hole in the fabric of reality. He wrote not of control, but of surrender, of the desire to become one with the entities that dwelled in the darkness, to dissolve into the chaos beyond human comprehension. Sarah discovered that the clock was crafted from obsidian, a volcanic glass that had been forged in the fires of the earth, a material that absorbed not just light, but the very essence of pain and despair. Silas believed that the 13 chimes were not merely sounds, but vibrations that resonated with the frequencies of other worlds, a series of harmonic keys that could unlock the gateway to the unknown. He wrote of the barrier between worlds, not as a wall, but as a veil, its thinness fluctuating with each chime, the veil growing more fragile with each passing midnight. He believed that when the clock finally struck 13, the door would not just open, but shatter, unleashing a torrent of chaos and madness into their world. Consumed by a mixture of morbid fascination and a growing sense of dread, Sarah began spending every night in the town square, her eyes fixed on the clock, its obsidian surface reflecting her own haunted gaze. She became a part of the clock's macabre ritual, a silent participant in its dark dance with the unknown. She meticulously recorded the chimes, noting the subtle variations in their tone and duration, her mind slowly unraveling with each passing night. She began to perceive the chimes as a language, a complex code that spoke of fear, death, and the dissolution of all that was known and safe. One night, as the clock began its haunting sequence of chimes, Sarah saw a figure emerge from the shadows that clung to the base of the clock tower, a creature of nightmare forged from bone and darkness. It resembled Silas, but twisted, distorted, and ancient, as if he had been aged by eons of contact with something beyond human comprehension. The figure was not a ghost, but something far more insidious, a being that had transcended the limitations of earthly existence. It was a monstrous mockery of Silas, a grotesque caricature of the man who had built the clock. Sarah tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the square, her throat constricted with terror. The figure smiled, a horrifying rictus that stretched its thin lips into a grotesque parody of human expression. As the clock chimed its 13th and final note, the figure raised its skeletal hand, the long, bony fingers beckoning her into the abyss. A dark, shimmering portal opened above the town square, a vortex of shadows and spectral light that seemed to suck in the very air itself. The square became a vacuum, all sound extinguished, all light consumed by the monstrous gateway. Sarah, caught in the pull of the void, felt herself dissolving, her consciousness fracturing into a million pieces as she was drawn into the darkness. The clock, silent now, stood as a monument to her doom, its obsidian surface reflecting the swirling chaos that had engulfed her. The next morning, the town awoke as if from a bad dream, the events of the previous night erased from their minds, their memories twisted and distorted to fit a more mundane reality. The clock was still, its hands frozen in place. The town square was empty, and Sarah, like a ghost, had been erased from the collective memory of Blackwood. Some spoke of her as a rumor, a half-remembered figment of the imagination, a tale whispered in hushed tones that was quickly forgotten. The clock tower stood there, a silent sentinel, its dark secrets buried deep within its obsidian heart, waiting for another soul to stumble into its web. Years passed, seasons changed, and new faces appeared in Blackwood, drawn to the town by some unseen force. They were oblivious to the dark history that lay beneath the surface, their minds untainted by the horrors of the past. But the clock remained, a malevolent presence that seeped into the very foundations of the town, its dark power waiting to be unleashed once more. One night, a young man named David, a newcomer with a troubled past and a restless spirit, felt an inexplicable pull toward the old clock. It was not curiosity, but a sense of dread, a morbid fascination that drew him like a moth to a flickering flame. He began to experience vivid nightmares, not merely dreams, but terrifying visions of shadows moving in the corners of his eyes, whispers calling his name in the dead of night, and the haunting melody of 13 chimes that seemed to pierce his very soul. The chimes echoed in his mind even when the clock was silent, a phantom symphony of terror that threatened to drive him mad. David, a man of logic and reason, tried to dismiss his experiences as mere stress, a byproduct of his troubled past. But the nightmares grew more intense, the whispers louder and more insistent. He found himself spending his nights in the town square, staring at the clock, his mind tormented by fear and an insatiable need to understand the horrors that lurked beneath the surface. He began to see the clock not as a simple timepiece, but as a gateway, a doorway to something unspeakable. He delved into the town's history, following in Sarah's footsteps, uncovering the long-forgotten stories of Silas and the clock, each discovery reinforcing his growing sense of dread. He found Silas's old cabin, not just abandoned, but violated, the walls scarred with strange symbols, the air thick with the stench of decay and madness. Inside, among the detritus and the decay, he found Sarah's old notes, her meticulous research on the clock and the door. He began to believe that she was trying to communicate with him, a spectral presence warning him of the danger, her voice a desperate cry from beyond the veil. He felt not a connection, but an echo, as if he was reliving a nightmare that had been played out countless times before. He spent his nights in the town square, just like Sarah, his gaze fixed on the clock, its dark surface reflecting his own tormented soul. He noticed, on certain nights when the moon hung heavy in the sky, faint, dark markings seemed to materialize on the clock's face, markings that matched the patterns he had found in Silas's cabin. He began to realize that the clock was not just a timepiece, but a map, a guide to the labyrinthine pathways of the other side. One night, David made a terrifying discovery, an epiphany that sent a chill of pure dread through his very bones. He realized that the 13 chimes were not always the same, their tones subtly shifting, their rhythm fluctuating as if responding to something unseen. He started recording them, each note meticulously documented, his mind becoming a chaotic repository of terrifying frequencies. He found a pattern, not a consistent sequence, but a constantly evolving code that seemed to respond to his own fear and desperation. He began to suspect that each sequence of chimes opened a different portal, each one leading to a different layer of the other side, a series of concentric circles of horror that led deeper and deeper into the heart of darkness. David also discovered that the portal that Silas had opened had never closed properly, the wound in reality still festering, a beacon for the creatures that dwelled in the void. He became convinced that he was destined to close that portal, to somehow fix what Silas had broken, to free Sarah and put an end to the horrors that plagued Blackwood. His obsession became his prison, trapping him in a cycle of fear and desperation. His life became a single-minded pursuit of understanding the clock, his days and nights dissolving into a chaotic blur. He neglected his health, his mind unraveling as he delved deeper into the darkness. The townsfolk began to whisper about him, labeling him the new clock watcher, a madman whose obsession had turned him into a shadow of his former self. He heard them, their words like distant echoes, but he didn't care, his mind consumed by a singular purpose. He started to have waking nightmares, his visions blurring the lines between reality and illusion, as if the veil separating worlds was slowly dissolving. He saw Silas, the monstrous figure from Sarah's story, his shadow looming over him, his cold eyes burning with a predatory hunger. The figure was not merely a hallucination, but a presence, a malevolent force that seemed to be drawing closer, a predator circling his prey. Silas seemed to know David, as if they were connected by some invisible thread, their fates intertwined in a macabre dance of destiny. He smiled, his grotesque rictus revealing teeth that were not of this world, and gestured to the clock, inviting David to join him in the embrace of the darkness. One night, David, consumed by a reckless desperation, decided to act. He believed he had deciphered a new sequence, a complex series of chimes that he was sure would close the portal. He built a crude device, a chaotic mess of wires, capacitors, and oscillators that could mimic the chimes of the clock. He set it up in the town square, his hands shaking as he prepared to face the horrors that he knew awaited him. As midnight approached, a thick, unnatural fog rolled into the town square, obscuring everything like a shroud drawn over the world. The temperature plummeted, the air becoming heavy and oppressive, as if a physical weight was pressing down upon him. David activated his device, the oscillators emitting a dissonant, high-pitched whine that seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of his being. The ground began to tremble. The clock in the tower started to shake, its hands spinning wildly, its obsidian surface glowing with an inner light. David saw the portal open above the square, a vortex of pure, unadulterated darkness, a gaping maw that threatened to swallow everything. But this portal was not as he had imagined it, not a gateway, but a rupture, a tear in the fabric of reality that was unleashing something unspeakable into the world. From it, grotesque creatures emerged, not merely shadows, but beings that defied description, their forms shifting and writhing in ways that defied human comprehension. They were drawn to the sounds of David's device, like insects drawn to a light, their cold eyes fixed on him. They moved towards him, their long, spindly fingers outstretched, their touch promising not pain, but oblivion. David realized his mistake, that his actions had not healed the world, but broken it further, unleashing something terrible into Blackwood. He tried to shut down his device, to stop the sounds that were attracting the monsters, but it was too late. The creatures were upon him, their cold hands dragging him towards the darkness. The air filled with their screams, not cries of pain, but sounds of pure, unadulterated malice, a symphony of terror that echoed in his mind. He screamed in return, but his voice was lost in the chaos, swallowed by the void that he had unleashed. The next morning, Blackwood awoke to a strange calm, the fog gone, the clock silent, and David nowhere to be found. The townsfolk, their memories once again conveniently altered, had no recollection of him. Some, like in a fever dream, remembered whispered tales of the clock and the shadows, but dismissed them as just that. The clock tower stood there, a silent sentinel, its obsidian surface gleaming in the morning light, as if nothing had happened, its secrets buried deep within its heart, waiting patiently for its next victim. A few years later, a young woman named Emily, a writer searching for the spark of inspiration, moved to Blackwood. She was intrigued by the town's unnerving quiet and drawn to the old clock, her writer's mind sensing a story that lay hidden in its shadows. One day, she stumbled upon an old diary in the town library, Sarah's diary, a window into the darkness that haunted the town. She became obsessed, falling into the same trap as those before her, pulled in by the allure of the forbidden. The clock was waiting for her, and it had plenty of time to plan her doom.